Welcome to the Green Urbanist podcast, where we explore sustainable placemaking, climate action in cities, and urban rewilding. I'm your host, Ross O'Kelly, an urban designer, educator, and sustainable placemaking consultant. Today's episode is a conversation with Chris Fitch, the author of Wild Cities, Discovering New Ways of Living in the Modern Urban Jungle.
My name is Chris Fitch. I'm a writer, I'm a geographer, and I've done a decade or so as a writer, either freelance or on staff, and now my focus is writing books.
The book Wild Cities is a lovely mixture of science writing with kind of travel writing. Basically, the author takes us on a journey through different cities around the world, which are in some way pioneering in how they're bringing wild nature and they're allowing biodiversity to thrive within cities. Some of these will be fairly well known, places like Singapore, but others I wasn't really aware of. Places like Tallinn in Estonia and Flagstaff in the United States. And in this podcast episode, Chris and I go through a number of these case studies, and he tells us how these cities have been so pioneering in terms of bringing wildlife and wild nature into cities and what we can learn from them. I had a chance to read an advanced copy of the book, which I really enjoyed, and I definitely recommend it to anyone who's interested in this topic. It's not available yet. It will be out on April 10th, 2025, but you can pre-order it now, so you can get the copy straight away when it is available. A link to the page where you can pre-order it is in the episode description. I found this episode really inspiring, and I think you'll get a lot out of it and a lot of follow-up reading to do, looking into the various case studies that are mentioned in the book. And you'll get a lot of examples of the way that nature can be brought into cities in different scales, from meadows to forest creation through to marine habitats and even architectural greening as well. So enjoy the episode, and I'll see you next time. Tell us about the book. Why did you write it? Generally, what's it about? And then we can get some of the details.
It's a very long story that I'll try to shorten to a reasonable degree. I think the first part of that is kind of why am I interested in a lot of the same things that you're interested in around green urbanism. I mean, like I said, I traveled a lot as a child. I grew up in the South Pacific because my family were based there. And coming back to the UK and then kind of living in towns and then living in London, there was always something that I found myself trying to understand. What was it that... we all have some kind of nostalgia, but for me, there was an element of I'm trying to reconnect with something, but I wasn't sure what it was. And over a long period of time, I came to understand that that there was this sort of missing feeling of nature in my life, that this is something I wanted to be connected with in the way that those sort of rose-tinted memories I had of as a child, and in a very biodiverse part of the planet. I had a moment where I was thinking, okay, I'm living in London and this isn't doing it for me in terms of urban nature, but I do want to be in a city because I enjoy cities a lot. So is there some perfect place that I should be looking for? Which, is a bit of a fool's errand. But I, with time, started picking up on little stories from different places around the world, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of the same ones that I did. But I was thinking, well, maybe looking for somewhere that's perfect is not going to get me very far. But if I could if I could bring together the little stories that I'm getting from different places, that they're still providing us with valuable lessons on a kind of theme-by-theme basis, this is something I could work with. And it was specifically reading about Wellington and their very impressive native bird restoration efforts that got me thinking, okay, there's a specific story here that means I don't have to be holding Wellington up and saying this is the perfect nature-filled city. It is impressively nature-filled, but I don't have to go around saying this is what all cities in the world should be emulating. Simply that from the perspective of native bird restoration, which is something that is relevant to lots of parts of the world, then there's been some very interesting and valuable projects and endeavours that have happened here. And you might not even say you want to do the same thing, but the point is it's something to learn from if that's something you're interested in. And once I began to pull on that thread, it was unraveling very, very quickly in the best possible way, where I thought, oh, okay, well, I can also think of this place that I've visited, or I've read about in the past, or I watched a documentary, or I spoke to somebody who knew something about this. And quite quickly, I'd kind of assembled half the book of, okay, I can see how I can build something here. And then it was really digging into the literature and trying to, and ultimately building this idea of what I kind of conceived of as a wild city, whatever exactly that means. But the idea of a nature-filled city, kind of taking the best from all these different places that I've focused on, and using those as the windows through which to look at what can often be really quite different areas of urban greenery, urban rewilding, and use that to kind of not exactly to build a city with all of them, but just to say that these are all valuable ways to begin thinking about our connection for, the majority of people on the planet who live in towns and cities, some kind of urban environment, and how do you make nature relevant to them? And it became a book. It became this book, Wild Cities, which I'm extremely excited to be able to finally reveal to the world, and as not just a concept in my head, but as an actual thing that's printed on paper.
That's great. Thanks for that intro. I think I'd love to come back to the title of the book, Wild Cities.
Yeah.
And I'm talking a lot about wild and wilding and rewilding in the podcast at the moment. It's a contentious term, and some people might say cities are like the opposite of the wild. How can these things come together? So I'd just love to hear your perspective on why was that a phrase or a concept that you wanted to tie in with the book and make it central to the book?
I mean, the title was one of the first things that came to me. So it kind of, in a sense, I kind of built around it. And I did for a long time during the writing process, try to detach myself and say, it could be something else. Here's some other possibilities. If anyone's got any better ideas, I'm very open to it. But I never found anything that was better, and it really kind of expresses, I think, quite well what I'm trying to say with the book. Because like you say, we don't think of cities generally, at least in an ideal world. We're not thinking of them as places that are wild. That's kind of an undesirable situation. And if you look back at the history of cities and settlements, a lot of it is about taking an environment that is wild in an undesirable way and saying, let's calm this down, let's make it more controlled, and let's make it a better place to live. For all the reasons we know, though, we don't necessarily want to live in something that is perfectly manicured, and that includes the nature in it. Maybe some people disagree, but my view is that it is nice to have something that is beyond human control. And maybe there is something contentious to this, but for me, nature, if you want real nature rather than decorative nature, something that is sculpted, if you want biodiversity, which was another kind of focal point for the book, although I don't want to put people off by talking too much about biodiversity, because as much as I'm sure most people listening to this will be very happy with that term, for in a wider audience, it's maybe not quite such a household word. But if I wanted to, my belief was that nature should be out of our control to some extent. That's that's sort of the definition of it. It's something beyond planning a little bit. We can get into that later if you like. But like I said, I was open to changing the title if something better came to me. But ultimately, the idea of talking about wildness and cities in a short, snappy name, I found myself going, okay, yep, this is it. Let's go with it.
That's great, yeah. And I think it comes through in the book. Why is it wild and not green cities or landscaped cities or whatever? It's the sense that the case studies in the book are very much about creating or making space for that unmanaged wildness to come into cities in a way that's safe and that works with in a dense environment, that kind of thing. So
and something talking about green can be it means a lot of different things, and if you are open to all of those things, be it ecology and biodiversity or green energy, you're looking at kind of sustainability, or if you're thinking about kind of a green society, somewhere that's green politically, let's say. I mean, there's so many ways to interpret that, and I think one of the challenges when you're writing a book, when you've got so many thoughts you want to get out, which is how I kind of was feeling when I was embarking on this project, is actually it's better not to try to talk about everything, but to try to be a bit more focused. And in that sense, I mean, lots of people have written about green cities, something like that, but they're taking a slightly different focus, perhaps, from what I was. And I guess it's trying to say, look, this is sort of the lane that I'm working in, and not feeling like I have to talk about everything, which actually can be really quite different subjects kind of smushed together.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. We're going to talk about there's 12 chapters and 12 city examples in the book, so we'll talk about some of those, but I'd like to just, as a bit of a structure, it'd be interesting to know from you, like, what are some of the key themes that emerged out of the book, and then we can sort of dip into the case studies from there.
Like I said, biodiversity was just a huge running theme, and kind of hand in hand with connectivity. And I found myself writing about this again and again. It seems like I hesitate to say the best way to do this, because I really don't want it to be, this is the guide to how to do it. But looking at the case studies and the examples that I include in the book, the places that I went to visit and the people that I met there, overwhelmingly the focus of what I was learning about, what people were saying to me, what their priority was with what they were doing with their project was to bring biodiversity into the place, whether you're talking about being on the streets, whether you're talking about little forgotten areas within the urban fabric, little bits of unused land in one form or another, whether you're talking about the buildings themselves or, I don't know, coastlines, riverbanks, things like this. It's about prioritizing that biodiversity over and above trying to dictate too much what you are saying should be here. Maybe there's some keystone species. You're saying, okay, it's quite important to have this specific thing, but by and large, it's what we want here is that resilience that comes from having lots of different things together, preferably kind of native species that would have been there before humans turned up and started putting concrete down. And then that connectivity, which people might disagree, you might disagree, Ross, but I do feel is missing a lot in some of these conversations, because having a something in one bit of a city on one side and having another something on the other side is great. Of course, we love having those things there, but they become so much more resilient, yes, but so much stronger if it's possible to connect them, so that it's not isolated little bubbles of nature within the city. And this is something that was coming up all the time, building corridors and having little reserves, whether we're talking about aquatic or marine reserves, or let's say little urban forests or wildflower meadows, but then finding a way to connect them together, so they're not you don't have isolated populations of whatever might live there, but actually that freedom to move around. And it was something that I found myself, I didn't go into the project thinking I want to write about connectivity. Yes, that's very important to me. It just came up so many times that I found myself writing, okay, here we go again. This is the same thing that I was talking about in the earlier chapter, just applied to a totally different environment, but it's the same basic principles. And I don't know if that's come across to you in the reading of it, but that was definitely something that I found myself going, okay, this is clearly an important theme that I really hope that people they do get this out of the book.
Yeah, it is clear, and I think there's a nice transition where you start the first chapter talking about Miyawaki mini forests in Tokyo, and then you move on to talking about the green corridors in Medellin, and you sort of make that transition where you're like, it's great to have these pockets of forests, but also what we learned from other cities is you have to connect up these habitats as well. And it sort of reminds me back to the early definition of rewilding was about core areas of nature connected by natural corridors, and the reintroduction of carnivores. It was cores, corridors, and carnivores. Carnivores are tricky to do in a city, but cores and corridors we can definitely do.
Exactly. Like, these are not original thoughts. They're not things that I've come up, or even the people that I spoke to have come up with. It's ideas that have been bouncing around for a long time. But I think it is useful to take those rewilding principles and to say, by and large, we can bring them into the city. Of course, the details are going to change. And you talk about carnivores, and one of the things that actually surprised me, that I came out of the writing process going, oh, I almost did a 180 on what I thought I was going to say about that, because I started thinking I was going to be saying how important it is to have animals in the city. And I like animals, and I like being in the city, and I like seeing animals in the city. But the more that I was reading about the problems of human-wildlife conflict in and outside of urban areas, I found myself coming away going, well, they can work, but maybe it's just the real urban adapters that we can say, oh, yes, they are really happy in the city. For the vast majority of animals, whether it's large or small, we need to find a way to help them work in not necessarily the city, if we want to think about really built up areas. But the point is, we have urbanized so much of the world that there isn't, it's really hard to find bits of the planet for wild animals to live in now where they aren't going to be interfered by humans. So if we expand the concept of cities, of wild cities, just to say anywhere that humans have gone and started building urban things, whether it's roads or buildings or whatever it might be, infrastructure, and to say, how do we minimize this conflict? How do we make it possible to have animals in these spaces without all sorts of conflict? And that can be, deadly for the wildlife and for people. And talking about smart corridors in all sorts of forms, and I'm sure this is something that you've discussed in depth on the podcast before, but recognizing that, we can't just be romantic about this. I am such a romantic about this. Oh, I'd love just to have animals wandering around in the city. And we all loved this in the early days of COVID when, okay, we're stuck at home, but look, there's animals wandering around on the street. That's so unusual. But it's just not realistic. And to have that smart thinking again, connectivity. Where are the animals coming from? Where are they trying to get to? What's their motivation? Broadly, we're not trying to dictate too much what's going on, but to understand, what do they want to do? How can we facilitate that in the sort of smoothest way possible, so that they can go about their business and the humans we can go about our business, and we're not getting in the way all the time and causing genuine actual danger.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the case studies of the looking at connectivity. So let me know where you want to start with that, and it'd be great to hear some examples.
Well, yes, I mean the main city for this is when I went to Colombia, to Medellin, which I'm sure people may know about the green corridors there, which have been, one of the main focuses has been on kind of cooling the urban environment, and that's obviously a hugely important factor. We all know about the fact that cities are hot places and they're getting hotter, and that won't be news to anyone listening to this, that having greenery on our streets and in our cities, it helps cool them down. But to have that connectivity as well, even if it's just between small little urban forests like Miyawaki forests, like you discussed, which can be packed into very, very small bits of the city. But it's hard for a lot of creatures to live in those small forests. So having sort of high quality greening of streets like they've done there in Medellin, it gives you the opportunity to kind of link them up, and again kind of adds so much more resilience to what you're creating there, because it's possible for all the wildlife, whether you're talking about the flora or fauna, to be kind of not to be trapped, basically. Then, like I said, it kind of comes up time and time again in the book, because I was looking. So I went to Tallinn in Estonia to kind of think about pollinators and wildflowers and wildflower meadows, because Tallinn stopped, or not entirely stopped, but they massively reduced cutting the kind of public land, the grass on the public land. They started in 2019, kind of beginning the reduction, and as I understand, it's kind of a steady reduction in the years since. And the idea is to encourage the native wildflowers, native plant life, and with that, the native pollinators that are attracted to that. And of course, then you get birds attracted because of the pollinators, and you're building an ecosystem within the city. And again, it's done. They don't have a lot of space, but it's done using these little abandoned bits between streets and walkways, and there's an old abandoned railway line that kind of fell out of use, and so it was kind of appropriated by the city. Okay, we're going to have what they call the pollinator highway, which is great because it stretches right across the city, so it's kind of got that accessibility to people in all areas. And having all these different spaces, but having them not, a pocket here, a pocket there, a pocket on the other side, but like little threads that run right through the city. It makes it a lot stronger, and it reduces the need to be kind of going in and kind of constantly maintaining, what's going on here. They do come out and mow these meadows kind of once a year, because they don't want it to turn into a full forest. It's kind of trying to keep a lid on it in that sense. But in every other way, it's kind of hands off, let it do what it wants. We've created the capacity for kind of nature to do its thing, and for biodiversity to kind of thrive.
Yeah, I was really interested to hear the Tallinn, Estonia example, because it wasn't a city that was really on my radar. I hadn't really heard about it before. And it gives such... I love the reduction in management, because it's such a simple thing that pretty much any city could think about doing in their parks or in the verges along roadways, and just saying, actually, it's just doing less. You don't have to go in and plant things. Although I think they did some seeding of wildflowers as well, which is, you know, very cheap and easy to do. So yeah, it's a really good example. And I think I've experienced a few places when I lived in East London, my local area, one year, for some reason, they didn't the local council didn't sort of make a fuss about it or even like sort of warn us it was going to happen, but they just stopped mowing everything for the whole summer. And it was absolutely amazing. You know, I'd been there for a couple of years before, and I'd always seen it, you know, all the lawns on all the estates and in the parks, all very, very manicured. And then one year they just left it, and it was just like wildflowers everywhere, insects everywhere. And I was like, this is so easy. Why do we just do this everywhere?
And I mean, of course, you don't want to do it everywhere, because you still want some grass that, you know, for example, people like to have a picnic on the grass. That's fine. People like to have a little football pitch and kick a ball around. That's also good. We like people getting outside and doing that. It's just finding the proportions, and that's going to be a kind of case by case, you know, local environment by local environment decision of what exactly is the balance we want here. But I can speak to my experience of being of growing up in parts of kind of London and the UK where there's nothing like that. There was nothing like that. It was all just flat grass. And of course, I wasn't aware of this at the time. I wasn't thinking about biodiversity. But you can be sure that it's, you know, a fraction of what it could be. With these examples that you're talking about. And there have been so many examples. I mean, in the book I write about, there's parts of Melbourne where it's been done, where I was reading very recently about an experiment in Warsaw in Poland, where there's some kind of natural, if you will, wildflower meadows that are just grown organically, and then plots of land that were seeded and kind of given a year to go through the cycle, and then comparing the two types of meadows, if you will, kind of the natural one and the quote unquote artificial one, and by and large, you know, you get the same degree of pollination. I think they did say that there were less butterflies that appeared in the sort of hand created, human sown one. But if you're talking about bees and hoverflies and these other types of pollinators, then, you know, it works totally as well as something that's grown organically. And that, for me, is just the perfect example of something where you're putting in the effort to create the situation where nature can do its own thing, and we're not having to constantly go in and interfere. You've done the initial work up front just to make sure that it kind of gets through those early phases, and then you by and large can step back and say, okay, you know, whatever wants to grow here can grow here, and whatever wants to come and feed on that nectar and so on, go for it.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think you're pointing towards something that is a big theme in rewilding, which is letting go of control, and, you know, I think that's come up in the book as well, hasn't it?
Yes, and not really, again, with too much intention. It's the kind of thing that people have said to me afterwards. Like, oh, you have some really strong opinions about this. I wasn't aware that I had such strong opinions. It's kind of something that I guess kind of came out subconsciously. But yeah, you said the perfect word there, which is control. And that letting go of control, I think, is so intimidating. It's not something that is natural for the way that so many people think. It runs counter to the instincts of, no, it should be like this. And especially when you're thinking about cities and these spaces which, you know, are so heavily planned and organized, and we're talking about infrastructure and layers of things upon things, and, you know, obviously people are thinking about these spaces to such incredibly detailed degrees, and then you get us rewilding folk showing up and saying, no, just let it go. And I totally understand why there's pushback on that. But I do think that having the bravery in whatever form we're talking about, whether it is kind of urban forests wildflower meadows, if we're talking about wildlife reserves, or rewilding our rivers, whatever it might be, having the courage to say, okay, to some degree, we want to be letting go of that control. And it's not going to be the same in every city, in every culture, in every country, but to not cling so tightly to that principle of, no, we must control what goes here. We must dictate what species can be found here and exactly how it appears, the aesthetics, how it's manicured. That's where I'm putting my flag in the ground, that no, we need to be willing to just step back a little bit.
Did you get a sense from all the people you spoke to when you were writing the book and you were visiting these places? Did you get a sense of how they successfully, navigated through that? I presume they had to do a lot of convincing of local communities and politicians and all that kind of thing.
I think, this goes back to kind of the threads through the whole book. But one thing that really came out of it was how there were almost no cases where you had either a complete top-down or kind of bottom-up approach to anything. Pretty much all of it had some combination of, okay, kind of the council are doing something, but there's a volunteer group that are doing something, or there's a national effort to do something or other, and there's a movement maybe that's sort of doing something similar along the same lines. It's hard to kind of pull this apart and understand exactly who's leading who. And maybe this is simply the ingredients of something that is successful, where you have those two elements working together, where it's not just a politician has decided that something must happen like this, and then you get community pushback. We know examples like this, right? Where the community might say, well, actually, maybe we would like some rewilding, who knows, but we weren't involved in this process. We know that it can't be done like that. And equally, it's very difficult for just a community to decide to do something if you've got leaders in whatever form who say, no, actually, it's not going to be like that. We're not supporting that. And so I think it's a good approach to recognize that maybe these are just self-selecting, but based on the projects that I did kind of discover and I went to visit in the book, it was always combinations of, you've got that top-down support providing kind of financing and the kind of legislation to make things happen, but you also have, community leaders, and you have kind of inspiring figures who can go out and deliver the message and help people understand, this is why we want to encourage whatever the project might be, and to actually engage with people. And we know the examples, right? Going into schools and explaining to the kids, because they get it, and then getting them excited about it and involved, and it can things can snowball from there, rather than being something that, I know how much, you can probably tell because I've written a book about it, I'm really, really fond of the idea of making cities kind of more biodiverse and ecological spaces and places. But if I was in charge, that doesn't mean I'm going to go around and just making things be how I want them to be, because you need to bring people along for the ride. The people that I met, I would say that by and large they've been smart in understanding how to do that. And overwhelmingly, it's people who are from the places that they're talking about, so they know how to. They know why it matters to people there. I know there's an extremely vague way to talk about lots of different movements and different kind of processes happening at the same time. But it definitely came out of the book that this is a common factor across all of those cities.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I'm really interested in this discussion of why something happens in one place and not necessarily in another. And I think one of the things I picked up from the book, and something I appreciated about your writing, was that you talked also a lot about the culture and the history of the place. which sort of gave a hint of why. Why is Singapore the city in the garden? Why did Miyawaki Forest come out of Tokyo? And it's they're sort of local responses to a very local issues, and mix in the local culture and whatever part of their history. And it was very interesting, and it sort of gave me an insight that we can't really just go and pluck a solution from a city and bring it to the other side of the world and expect it to work, but we need to sort of come up with something that makes sense locally for us.
I mean, I don't know how much we can be directly drawing lines between those things. I mean, there definitely are, like those examples you gave of, why did the Japanese government want to push forest bathing? It was a response to a specific social problem around overwork and burnout and unfortunately cases of suicide. That this was one of many ways in which to try to reduce that, of saying people should be going to nature, and this will be good for your kind of physical and mental health. Singapore was in a situation where they'd sort of found themselves independent in the middle of the 20th century. In a way that perhaps wasn't planned for, and kind of latched onto nature as one way to kind of build a new nation, which is quite an incredible thought and kind of incredible endeavour to be taking on. And so those examples, I would say, fit fairly well. There's other ones where I don't know if you would immediately say that there's a reason related to the history of the place why nature projects or rewilding became something that was relevant to that city. Certainly, I find it very enjoyable to learn about different parts of the planet and to understand, what is the history of this city, because they're all different. They have such fantastic different personalities. And when do these projects fit into another city? Like, when can you pick one up and just put it somewhere else? Is a fascinating topic in itself, because you take a Miyawaki forest example. I mean, there's Miyawaki forests all over the place, and it is a model that is. I mean, of course, it's completely different everywhere you go, because you're looking at what is the kind of natural biome. The sort of the potential vegetation of whichever part of the planet we're looking at, but the concept can be applied pretty much everywhere, and people seem to get excited about it. And I don't think they all have to know the story of Dr. Miyawaki and his experiences in Japan and in Germany, and how he personally came up on that. It's not particularly relevant in the way. People just kind of understand, oh, right, we can quickly grow a little forest in the city. Well, that's very exciting. Let's do that. So I don't know. It would be fascinating to get into the psychology of exactly how some of these projects came to be so successful, kind of what's the secret sauce to different places. But I am not the person with the training to take on that endeavour. I think just explaining what happened and what the consequences were is probably enough for this particular project.
That's great. One of the other key themes that I think sort of came out was the role of communities. You mentioned a little bit about it, but how local communities have been quite, critical and very involved in the sort of projects you're talking about in the book. Can you give us a couple of examples of that?
I think it's an important point to make, because so often this topic, and so many environmental efforts are kind of presented, at least the way that I look at the media, presented as being done to people. And you either are supportive of it being done to you, or you don't want it to be done to you. And that's where the argument and the debate happens. But understanding that a lot of people really like having nature around them, a lot of people living in urban places would like a lot more nature. And if you have a garden, well, that's great. You can do all sorts of things with that. And that connects again to what we were saying about the connectivity, that, there's so much evidence talking about the importance of gardens. That's a whole, way more than I would have expected. So that's a separate but very important point. But what I saw in so many parts of the world was people who really want nature in the place that they live, and either as individuals or more commonly as groups saying, okay, let's get together and do what we can to make that happen. And this, again, it kind of goes hand in hand with the grassroots and the top-down thing. I'll give you an example. I visited Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, which it loves to talk about being, the only city in the world, the wildlife capital of the world, because they have a national park within the city. It's not. There's a lot of wildlife parks in Kenya, and Nairobi National Park is a very little one. But they're incredibly proud of it, and they should be, because it's a large part of the city that has been set aside for native wildlife, and we really are talking, giraffe and zebra and lions. Big sort of classic Lion King type wildlife. And this is something that is, you can't do it without the support of the government and down, right? It just wouldn't work. No one can decide to create this. But I spent a lot of time while I was there meeting people from this amazing organization, FONAP, which is the Friends of Nairobi National Park. And the fact that they have, a huge community of people who are working together to basically advocate on behalf of the park, because the park doesn't have a voice, the animals don't have a voice, but these people do, and they are constantly going into the local media. Sometimes you get protests if they feel like, oh no, someone's trying to encroach too much on the park, which is a constant problem. Nairobi's an expanding city. There's a lot of people who would like to take that land for development. But for people who can go out and speak up for the park and for the wildlife that lives there, and brings so many benefits in terms of connecting people who live in Nairobi, and especially kids growing up in Nairobi, with that kind of native Kenyan wildlife, not to make it be something that they see on TV like the rest of the world. And every 2 months they get together and will go around one kind of morning, drive around the park, do surveys. It's all very top quality citizen science, so they can keep showing, oh, here's the data, here's what's in the park, and constantly saying, this is something we want, and don't you dare think about taking this away from us. It's just one example, and it's a very specific example that's not going to apply everywhere. But again, it's the concept. It's the saying that this is important to us, and we're very willing to work to demonstrate that, and not, again, it's not, you don't want a sort of tragedy of the commons type thing, or you go, well, it's not my responsibility. I pay my taxes and someone else should be taking care of this. But saying people saying, no, we really care about this, and we want to go and make sure that it's protected, and do whatever is necessary to maintain that urban nature they have. And the same thing exists around the world. I went to Sydney to look at the marine environment. It's just incredible. Sydney Harbour has more species. Just one little harbour, right? There's more species, marine life in that harbour than you find around the entirety of the British Isles or within the entirety of the Mediterranean.
That's pretty gobsmacking.
I keep saying it, and you feel like that can't be true, but the numbers don't lie. Anyway, there's kind of movement, questions over the years, or maybe we should, to what degree should we be protecting this? There is no universal citywide marine park, but there are pockets that are protected. And there's one bit that I kind of went back to a few times because people I was meeting there in Sydney kept saying, "Oh, this is a great example of kind of urban marine life." It's called Cabbage Tree Bay, and it's a very small, very very tiny little bit of the harbour, but because it's very strongly protected, and the point is we don't normally think about humans and nature and humans and biodiversity going together very well, but because the community are so involved in this particular bit of the harbour, there's so much so many passionate people who are kind of watching over it, if you will. And again, like the wildlife park in Nairobi, they're advocating on behalf of it. They're saying, no, don't you dare think about doing anything to this because we know how valuable it is. That you're not allowed to do any fishing or anything. It's like super highly protected, incredible biodiversity for such a very small bit of the harbour. And again, this is not a top-down thing. And I'm not going to speculate on what the governments would be doing if they had their own way. But the point is, it's almost an irrelevance because you've got the people who live there, the community, saying, yes, we live in a city, but we really like nature. We really like this specific nature that lives here now, and we're going to band together and make sure that the what we have is protected, and possibly even expanded if that's we can imagine such a luxury. So, I mean, it was incredibly inspiring to meet people who are really pushing this. We hear it so much, but this kind of thinking global and acting local mindset of, we're not saving the world, but we are saving this bit around where we live, and we can do everything we can to look after this. And it's just amazing how it flies in the face of the way that thinking about the environment, protecting the environment is so often like a trade-off. Oh, what are you willing to sacrifice for nature? It just isn't that in these particular cases.
Yeah, and it can be such a huge source of meaning and joy for people as well to have nature around them and be involved in some sort of stewardship and protection of it.
Yeah, I mean, I found I wrote so many pages about everything we know about the mental health and the physical health and all the benefits of well, I mean, I was just repeating myself over and over again, kind of saying like trees are great for us and birds are great for us and wild swimming is great for us. And I just had to cut it back because I think by the end people get it.
Exactly. We're coming up sort of last 10 minutes or so. I'd be interested in maybe just getting a little bit of an insight, just for people who are listening, they can get a little bit more of an inside scoop on what's in the book. If I could read out the names of a couple of the case studies and you just give us like the little short summary of what that chapter is about.
It sounds like a fun game, yes.
The memory test for you. I'm sure it's still fresh in your memory. Munich, Germany, the city with the free-flowing river.
Yeah, the Isar River, which, I mean, it is snappy. So basically, 100 years ago, it was channeled. The Isar River in Munich, it floods a lot. People in the 19th century said, no, that's bad, turned it into a concrete channel. And then 100 years later, people said, actually, we think that maybe that was a mistake and seems like we're still having floods. And so now it's much more holistic because they pulled all the concrete out and it meanders and it's got little bays and there are bits where you can swim and they cleaned up the water as well. So there's a lot more biodiversity and there's even beavers, like huge numbers, very large beavers right in the city center of Munich. And it's quite incredible and very inspiring.
Oh, love that. Okay, well, Munich is on my travel list now. Fantastic. And also, I guess just to say as well, not a unique situation because all over Europe and the UK, rivers have been altered, massively. So sort of renaturalization and return of beavers and that kind of thing is, definitely something that's also happening in different places.
Yes.
I was quite interested
What's the next
in
test?
Flagstaff in the US, the city where night is
Yeah.
protected.
It really goes in a very different direction. But I was really interested. Sorry, light pollution. That's the focus of this. And I mean, this is one with a very unique history because you had this guy, Percival Lowell, who at the end of the 19th century, he had money and he had a passion for what he thought was going to be his life's goal, which was finding life on Mars. Who hasn't had that particular ambition? And so he used his money to go out west because at the time the east coast of the US was getting electrified. That's the right word, right? Electrified. Because street lighting had just become a thing. And so he found a remote bit of Arizona in a settlement that had 100 people and said, okay, I'm going to build an observatory here. I'm going to get a giant telescope and I'm going to find life on Mars. And he did not find life on Mars, unfortunately. But the observatory is still there, and now they do some fantastic work. They found Pluto some decades later. But the point is, it's right outside the city of Flagstaff, which has grown to be from 100 people to something short of 100,000 people. They also have electricity now, along with all of the normal things that make cities. I mean, we know about the issues with cities and nature, but their specific thing was we would really like to be able to see the night sky because of this observatory. And actually, there's other observatories that moved into the area. It's just because of the low humidity and so on. It's just a great place to be stargazing. And so starting in the 1950s, they began introducing various rules around the use of kind of outdoor lighting. And these have been getting kind of in waves, kind of updated over the years as more and more, as the city grew and there's been more and more light kind of projected into the night sky. You know, most of us living in cities can't really see stars.
Yeah.
It's something that's been taken away from us. I think something like 60% of people in Europe can't see, I think it's the Milky Way, was that statistic? And there was something like 80% in North America. I mean, it's just not part of people's life. But somewhere like Flagstaff, there are limitations. They use a particular metric, which is lumens per acre. And you have to look at your plot of land and work out, you know, how much light am I allowed to emit?
Wow.
And again, fantastic community connection because people who have grown up there, they understand why, they know this story. They understand why it matters. They care. They are very proud that they live in a part of the world that they can look up at night and they can just see the Milky Way. They can see all these constellations. There is still that connection to the night sky. And that's something that, I mean, light pollution is a problem everywhere. In a sense, it can be, you can just sort of turn the lights off and the problem goes away. But of course, you know, people don't have that, in other cities don't have that heritage. So there's a lot of education in it. And Flagstaff is a brilliant example of how that can be done differently.
And there's presumably lots of benefits for wildlife with having dark skies as well, isn't there?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a huge. I mean, the number of. Where do you begin? There's birds who try to navigate by who navigate through the using their circadian rhythms in the same way that we have circadian rhythms. I mean, something like 1 billion birds are killed in cities every year, and I think that's just a North America figure.
Wow.
So that's, you know. We're talking specifically about window strikes because birds often can't see glass. I'm sure, again, your listeners kind of know about this problem. And all these lights off initiatives to kind of stop migrating birds from being distracted by all the completely unnecessary light coming out of cities at night. You know, it's an incredible loss of life that can be made better. We're talking about moths, which are sort of underrated pollinators, but completely get bamboozled by artificial lighting and become much less, you know, much harder for them to find food, to breed. The amount of light in marine environments. There was a study of the marine environment around Plymouth in the UK, and I think something like 3/4 of the coastline was considered, like unhealthy levels of artificial lighting at night, which, Plymouth is a city which likes to shout about itself as kind of the ocean city of the UK. And it's just very hard for marine life to survive in that environment, especially if, let's say, you're a coral reef who is programmed to kind of sync your spawning sessions with the lunar cycle. And if you can't detect light from the moon, then you're not going to sync up at the right time. And, the biodiversity loss is huge. And those are just a handful of examples. But you're right. It's not just humans. It's the ecological world as well.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that about marine life. That's really interesting to know.
I mean, obviously only relevant where the city is next to the coast, but yes. In those places, and we do tend to really enjoy living around the coast, these issues kind of smash together. You're thinking about marine conservation in an urban environment. You're thinking about light pollution in an urban environment, and then, they kind of compound.
Yeah. All right, fascinating. I think we'll wrap things up there. I want to say huge thanks for just sharing all your stories and all the information from the book. I'll put a link to where people can go and buy it or pre-order it in the episode description. But is there anything else, anywhere else you want to send people to, or any sort of final shouts you want to make?
Shout out to lots of support I have received. I have to say, both the Society of Authors and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation in the US both gave support to undertake this project, which is obviously not an easy undertaking. And I hope that the book does find its way to people who would be interested in this topic, and like you said, I'm sure the links will do the work. But thank you to anyone who does buy it, and thank you, Ross, for this time.